Welcome to the MI Hunting Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be going over my scouting strategy as we head into the 2023 deer season. All right, what's going on, everyone? Again, welcome to the MI Hunting Podcast. Thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in as always. So this episode, we're basically at the very edge of the start of the 2023 deer archery season here for Michigan. I know some other states have already gotten started, but for here, we've got about another week to go. And it's going to be go time essentially. So basically, with this episode, I wanted to touch base on some of the things that I do in regards to my scouting routine when it comes to deer hunting. Certainly starting out, I wasn't very good at it. I struggled to really find good spots. I'd find an area that seemed like, I would think would be good and had, maybe a deer trail on it, and that's probably hunted. And of course, no surprise there, I had very little success with it. I would, get some trail camera pictures on the few areas I did run cameras on in the past. Most of the deer were either nocturnal or, they were just areas that I didn't plan out very well of, high concentration of deer movement. I didn't plan out my routes all that well for entry and exit routes, and I just struggled. As I progressed further and further, doing it more and more every year, I eventually started to pick up on a lot of things that I either just wouldn't see or had some, predetermined, thoughts on what I thought I was seeing or how the deer were utilizing the landscape. Basically, I will say this, I'm not a fast learner when it comes to scouting and learning what deer do and how they're utilizing the landscape. So a lot of times I have to revisit or really, basically kind of build that up. And as I've gone over the few years of really diving into heavy scouting and scouting more often and just, being out in the woods more and just really just scouting all the time, really, or be looking at, aerial maps or, just thinking about previous places I've hunted that have, maybe I didn't quite figure out. So this episode, I wanted to really kind of just cover my thought process when it comes to the scouting and how I pick my locations where I want to hunt, and when I decide that a spot's no good, or if I need to dive in a little bit deeper and figure a spot out a little bit more in depth. So on this episode, we're going to be looking at a couple of maps of some areas that I have scouted and hunted in the past. I'm going to kind of break those down, kind of my thought process in approaching those properties and kind of the things I've learned and some of the things I've observed in those areas as to why they're either good spots or not. But before we get into the mapping and the scouting breakdown, I do want to highlight again that again, we've just released the new website, so it's mihuntingpodcast.com. Go ahead and check it out. Basically is a combination of all the content that I put together for MI Hunting Podcast. So you'll have access to all of the podcasts as well as any of the videos that I produce as well. We're adding some additional features. We'll be doing some articles, a breakdown of some of this kind of the things that we've been doing here, and kind of diving into some topics a little more in detail, and if you'll talk to us through a little bit more as well. We're going to have a monthly newsletter that will start out starting in October, where basically it's going to just highlight some conservation news type stuff, some things for to keep in mind, recipes, again, a few stories that we'll add in, anything that we really have that just kind of a quick reminder or just kind of get you in the know of some of the things that are going on for the month, really. We do have a store open as well, so we do have some items that are available for purchase. These are some logo wear items that I've worked pretty hard on making sure that they're good quality products and that the logo wear is up to snuff, or at least for quality that I would be something that I would be interested in purchasing and wearing. So As you see, I've got one of the shirts on now. Again, we've got several different colors available for different, for whatever suits you fancy. We've got t-shirt, long sleeve shirt, hoodie. I do have these hats available as well. These are Richardson 112 hats with a heat pressed leather patch on them, which are pretty comfortable. Richardson hats are probably one of my favorites in regards to comfort to wear. And then added the pretty cool etched leather patch on there. I'm pretty happy with them. And certainly be on the lookout for more items coming up. I do have some other designs that I have in mind that hopefully will be in production soon or be added to the store as well. So other things outside of just the logo wear. So there'll be some kind of unique shirt designs or stickers and whatnot that'll be available as well. And also, if you want to support the show more directly, you become a membership where you will again support the show directly, enabling me to continue on with producing more content, and if you'll make some additional investments to make the show even better and to expand on what content is available as well. So, and outside of that, your membership will also grant you access to a monthly live show that we'll be doing, as well as you'll get a discount on everything that's sold in the store for the life of your membership. You'll get exclusive members only giveaways, and as a member you'll get a free gift as well just for signing up. So that's it for the plugs. So let's go ahead and get into talking about these mapping, or talking about these areas of interest. So basically what we're going to start out with is we're going to have essentially 3 areas. One area is an area that I've hunted before and had basically scouted additionally and learned basically from last year. We got another spot that I scouted some and didn't really hunted nearby, but didn't hunt in the exact area where I scouted this year. And then thirdly is a brand new spot that I've never hunted before that I just explored just this year. So let's go ahead and get into those areas. Again, we're going to start out with one that I've had experience with before and kind of what I've learned as basically the second year into it of hunting this area. All right, so this is the first of the 3 spots. Now this is an area that I had hunted before, I've hunted now for about 2 years now. And basically I hunted further north up here in some of this thicker cover. There's an old, clear cut there, and then some pines, and then basically some overgrown, undergrowth or understory, a bunch of popple, and miscellaneous mature trees as well. So basically what I did was basically on my way out one time, just started scouting my way out and came across further south, there's a little bit of an opening that had some, basically it had been logged long ago, and it's got some more mature oaks growing in, as well as a bunch of understory basically ferns that are growing in here. And I noticed that part of my walk in and out is that there were several spots of where it looked like there had been bedding and a lot of trails basically moving from east to west here on the property. So basically I started scouting this area, again starting out with the mapping area, and just started mapping out different trails that were, a lot of them were moving from north to south, but then also there were several that were running from east to west as well. So pulled up the mapping area, and again, one of the first things I like to do is kind of look at the terrain. So right out the get-go, you can see that there's a bunch of thick timber on either sides of the property, and then essentially through this area is intermittent, mature trees, as well as, again, the ferns. Now, with that alone, it's not too, doesn't really stand out all much, other than the fact that there is that significant amount of, cover to the west. And now that area is actually fenced off to where I can't actually hunt that area. So, again, it's one of those things that kind of stands out as a potential, sanctuary area where deer are going to feel comfortable in there because they know they're not going to get much pressure in there. So it comes down to starting to break down where the deer are going to come from or where they're going to be going, and basically in part of my boots on the ground scouting, I did find a patch of basically a patch of white oaks that were a vast majority of them were developing or dropping acorns. So right in this patch here, there's a significant patch of the white oaks. Again, a lot of them were dropping mass amounts of acorns. And then all basically to the more or less the north, there's a bunch of immature oak trees that definitely showed a bunch of browse where you could see that deer were coming in here. So the other thing I'm looking at is when a lot of times when it comes to the terrain. So we basically show that there's a patch of kind of an old clear cut and a food source. There's no significant water anywhere in this area other than there are some retention ponds further north, but water is an issue in this location. So the next thing I look at quite often is looking at the contour lines or seeing where there's elevation differences. And they are somewhat hard to see here, but there is basically a funnel where there's high ground on either side of this area, and then there's a little bit of a valley through the central part of this area where the deer kind of funnel up into where these white oaks are. So during the course of running trail cameras on this oak little patch here, did have significant number of deer that were in here. A lot of does and fawns that were going in there, and then also the bucks started showing up again that mid-October time frame, especially when some of those acorns were really starting to get cleaned up a little bit from the deer that were coming in here. So I came across this spot late in the season, or not late in the season, but I guess about mid-October. So I kind of call it that peak of probably when those acorns were dropping, but there was still enough of them still falling that I was able to at least capitalize on some of that deer movement still. So I set up a camera and set up a mock scrape in the patch of those oaks to try to at least kind of focal any potential buck movement that were coming in that area, kind of meandering around in those oaks flats. So I showed that there's significant deer movement because of the the good food source with the white oaks. The next spot was confirming with the trail camera to confirm the type of deer movement that was there, as well as what type of deer were showing up. Basically, what I ended up doing was isolating this area a little bit, created that mock scrape, as well as the camera, and then looked at areas of opportunity for tree stand locations. So I started out essentially directly south of that patch. So it was basically 20 yards into that patch I could shoot. The issue is that it was very limited on the ability to essentially get multiple shot opportunities. There's another spot off to the west or off to the east that is just just to the east of the oak flat. This is an area where a lot of those immature oak saplings are growing in, and where there's a lot of browse, where it seemed like based on the camera intel that a lot of the bucks were moving more so from the east to west direction, and more of the does were traveling to north and south. So a lot of those bucks were coming in from the adjacent property. Now to the east there, I don't know exactly where those bucks are exactly living or coming from. There's a lot of private property off to the east there, and I don't have access to it, so I don't know how far away those bucks actually are, or basically they're that location that's where they actually are bedding. So I suspect they're bedding mostly to the east, but they could also be here on the west side within that area that is going to be much more secluded and have very little, if zero, human interference. And then the last spot I picked was further north. So again, this is more, it's probably about 40 to 60 yards away from that oak flat. And it's basically, again, trying to catch these deer before they make it to that oak flat, as well as take advantage of a potentially different wind direction. So, the two tree stands I have to the south are for more, again, a north wind or wind coming out of the north. Now this again could be isolated to, or could be as wide a range of any wind out of the north could be hunted out of these two locations. To the north, as you would suspect, for anything with a south wind. Now ideally it's either directly south wind or wind coming out of the south, Don't always remember exactly when you say south wind if it means coming out of the south or going south, but anything coming out of the south. And then also to have, kind of it coming out of the west. So southwest wind as my avenue of approach is basically walking along the property line along the northeast side to where I can park. So this area is, again, has a nice food source available. You have terrain that funnels the deer movement. Access isn't that all that difficult. As to the south, about 100 yards out, there's a main highway that you can park along. And then from the north, it is a bit of a farther walk, but you can basically walk into this area with relatively, low impact, especially because this is a long, narrow property. And again, I don't suspect that a lot of the deer are bedding, within that area. Most of them are bedded on adjacent properties. So this makes it ideal for being able to come in here and, not really, be stuck in a stand, with deer, either bedded right on top of you where you can't get down, or where they're feeding and they're not going to move out of the area as well. The downfall with it, again, with it being a narrow property, that, you're either going to see the deer or you're not really, I guess I should say. I mean, it's one of those areas where you have limited access. So if, those bucks that do frequent this area, you're only going to catch up with them in that small window that they're in, on this property. It's very difficult to expand and learn further or be able to, cut the distance on where those deer might be coming from because of the property lines. But this is just one area that, again, started out hunting further north, and then is gradually just kind of relearning an area and finding a focal point of, deer movement, and utilizing some in-season scouting from years past to find a pretty hot spot in regards to, the time of the year with those acorns dropping and some of the pre-rut coming in, getting those bucks up on their feet more and venturing out more than their typical, feed the bed pattern. Now, so far in this year, I've run a camera and, scouted those oak trees from that patch. They are producing some acorns, but certainly not as much as last year. So there is a potential that they're not going to have the, it's not going to be as hot of a spot this year as it was last year, in regards to just the fact that the food source is going to be a little bit more limited than what it was last year. But, again, it's going to be, I'm still trying to learn a little bit about this spot because of the fact that it's, I didn't really discover this spot, until about mid-October last year anyway. So more to come will be for this spot on if it's still going to hold the same type of deer movement patterns or bucks that showed up last year. But it's definitely one of those spots where, again, it's a very small area, very easily overlooked. A lot of the hunters that hunt in this particular area hunt much further to the north, where there's a far bigger area to, kind of look at and, basically hunt. A lot of this further to the north, there are some good areas along the edges as well, but to the vast majority of the middle, it's either clear-cut, open field, or basically a very, 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 very thick patch of popples that, you could hunt the edges, but the idea of trying to get in there to be able to hunt those locations, it'd be very difficult to be able to get in and out without essentially making a ton of noise and spooking a lot of deer. The problem is, too, is with it being so thick in there, that the potential for deer movement being kind of sporadic within there is pretty high too. So it'd be really hard to pinpoint exactly where those deer are coming from in that area. The only other spot that I have of interest for this spot is to the southern part of the edge. I'm on kind of part of the L shape of the property. There's a patch of pines here that are running on the south side of this clear cut, as well as that really thick patch of popples. There again is a little tiny valley from the contour lines. It's basically a little bit lower than the, where the popples are, and it filters down into a lower area down where the pines are. And through this little area where there's a tiny bit of patch of clear cut as well, there are some areas where there are, clearly some rub lines that have been historic, where there's rubs from past years as well. Again, the hard part is really getting in there, and then you have basically kind of a limited access to be able to hunt this in different winds, because you basically have to have a wind out of the north at all times. And then even at that, with that patch of pines, it's all mature red pine. There's no significant cover in there, so you really have to be reliant on the deer travel. I suspect mostly during the pre-rut and rut, you might be able to capitalize on this, but outside of that, those historic rubs, you don't know if they're utilizing that during the daytime. There's nothing really other than that significant cover to the north that would suggest why these deer have to go through here or be here on a routine basis. So again, an area that I've kind of highlighted, but not an area where I've focused a ton of my attention to, based on the available, the access routes aren't the easiest getting in and out of there, as well as it doesn't have the kind of multi-tier kind of breakdown of the spot where there's multiple things going for it at once. This kind of has this one or two things that aren't really all that convincing in regards to a good spot or not. So I guess that's one thing that I guess I kind of neglected to cover before even jumping in these spots. Typically what I'm looking at is, especially when I pull up a map, is where if I'm looking for contrast. So if it's a very thick patch of woods, is there an opening, or is there a bunch of is there a water source nearby, like a pond or a clear river or creek or something that stands out essentially. So anything that really catches my eye right out the get-go. And then more often than not, the next thing I'm looking at is those contour lines. So I'm looking at the terrain as to elevation differences. Are we looking at, are there significant hills? Are there valleys? Are there bowls? Are there low points? Are there ridges? Are there plateaus or benches? Those are areas of not necessarily like saying that one terrain feature is better than the other, but I'm looking for that terrain, or again that contrast in the terrain that would either funnel or attract deer movement. And then of course looking at those water sources, at those food sources, if you don't have anything that really stands out, so if there's not like an open field, or it's not like a food plot or egg field or something like that nearby, looking for that other type of feed, whether it's acorns, soft mass, so apple trees. If you're looking at woody browse, so if you're looking for areas that have a lot of new cessation or new growth from an old clear cut or something along that line, looking for those areas where there's clearly been deer browsing on the woody browse or feeding in those areas. And then the other thing I'm really usually looking at when it comes to the public land areas is I try to, if it looks like an area that's kind of like a no-brainer, or one that very easily stands out, don't be surprised when you put your boots on the ground that someone else has found that spot as well. So I try to look for areas that are maybe off kind of the beaten path, maybe not the best spot to focus on, but something that has a lot of the same features, a lot of the same, again, those components that you would still look for on those tier 1 locations that you can find on a tier 2 spot that may not have, may not be as as good of a spot, but it's still pretty darn good in regards to still having a lot of the features that deer are going to look for. All right, so this is the second location. Now, again, this is an area that I've hunted before a couple years back, and what caught my attention on this spot is you can see there's some clear areas where there's been some clear cutting done, and that was the focal point of what really drew my attention. So what we've got here is basically this northern clear cut here. It's been there probably for, honestly, I don't know how long that clear cut has been done, but it's been there for several years. So There's a lot of new growth coming in. From the map, you can see that there's a lot of all the smaller or more immature pines are starting to grow up a little bit. So there's actually quite a few of them in there that are large enough to be able to hunt out of or hang a tree stand out of. There's additional clear cut that's only within the past 3 to 5 years. So there's a lot more smaller plants that are growing in there now. A lot of immature oaks and popple in this southern region. And then they did leave basically a strip in between the two clear cuts. That strip's probably 70 to 80 yards wide, with two significant groups of mature timber on either side of those clear cuts. Off to the west, we've got a swamp area where they have, basically have logged before, and there's kind of I guess I would say, where it looks like they planted some old, rye fields or whatnot. It's starting to grow in, kind of more of a, starting to grow in more and more with different weeds and forbs and, briars and whatnot, as well as a bunch of ferns are starting to grow in there. But then again, a big old patch of, swampland where it's just a lot of open grasses and marshland. So this spot initially caught my attention, just having that clear cut there. Just the idea that it seemed like, with that, significant cover to the north and those different patches where they, didn't clear cut, that this would be a good spot, basically as a food source for the deer, as well as, diving into the mapping a little bit more. Again, the next big thing is looking at the contours or the elevation differences. The north edge of this clear cut, there's a valley. Kind of turns into a bit of almost a strip of cedar swamp that runs through here. And then also there's a small creek that runs through that cedar swamp that dumps into the more swampland or that marsh further to the west. So we've got food from the clear cut, and then we got a water source, and then we've got a change in the type of cover that's in the area. So what I had done, that first year of scouting it, I kind of went into it hunting blind. And so what I did was I initially started out on the edge of the clear cut. So I basically hung out on the kind of the northern side of, this edge. Essentially I had a, wind that came out of essentially the southwest. So I parked off the 2-track to the east, walked down along the edge of the clear cut, and found my tree. And that very first sit, I actually had a pretty decent sized buck coming from the clear cut, heading north towards the rest of the timber to, I'm assuming bed down. Again, this is, mid to late October. So I think the first sighting I had with him was, I think it was around October 22nd or something like that. So, it looked very promising that, I caught this buck out cruising. It was probably a good 40 minutes after daylight. And, I had really high hopes that I would be able to catch up with this deer again. Next time through, about 4 days later, had similar conditions. So basically I moved to a different stand location where I came out originally, where this buck had came through and headed into the timber to the north the first time. Sat within bow range of that location around the same time, about 15 minutes probably later than I seen him the first time. What does he do? He comes out probably about 30 yards from the location where I sat originally, heading from the cover into the clear cut. So at this point, I'm feeling like I really don't know exactly what this buck's doing, why he flip-flopped his travel route when I had relatively the same conditions from one hunt to the other. Basically it was a high pressure day, so nice and sunny that morning. Wind direction was relatively the same. Temperature was relatively the same. It was certainly one of those things where I figured he would do the same thing, seeing as how I had essentially the same conditions, 2 hunts in a row. That same season, after that second time of seeing him, noticed that he funneled a lot of his movement down towards a focal point of the clear cut at a focal area where he crosses a 2-track that leads down into further south of the clear cut. the third hunt, I ended up moving into a patch of some mature pine, or maturing pine, I guess I should say, and try to catch up with him as that focal point, kind of that pinches him down, some of that movement. Again, same thing when it comes to terrain. We have this little bit of a ridge here. It's a low point on the east side of the clear cut, and then a high point here on the west end, essentially. And he seemed to be using that plateau or the edge of that kind of that ridge there for his movement as he moves south. Ultimately, the buck didn't come within range. He actually ended up spotting some does that were in the area, and it was more focused on them and not getting within bow range of me. So ultimately, I started scouting some more and looking further south, seeing as how I couldn't figure out or narrow down an area within bow range to be able to ambush him from the north side. So I traveled down to the south, thinking that he would focus his movements on the southern part of the clear cut, where this little pinch point is, where the cover is between the two different sections of clear cut. And sure enough, right on the end of, basically right smack dab in the middle of this strip, there's a bit of a high point and some thick cover between some more immature pines and some denser cover in comparison to more mature kind of open wood or open timber area to the east. Right here at that point, again, a change of the terrain. There were significant rubs and scrapes, and definitely what looked like to be a large-bodied deer that was bedding in this area. So definitely became a focal point of my scouting, or my focus where I thought I could ambush a deer. Unfortunately, here's the kicker. As you can see from the map, there's basically this area kind of sticks out as what would be considered an area of focus for a lot of different hunters. Sure enough, just to the northwest or northeast, of that spot, found multiple tree stands in the area. So a lot of the other hunters kind of found this spot as well, and kind of pinpointed it. Now, I had considered basically setting up it within the clear cut, somewhere around 60 to 70 yards from this location. The problem is because of how open it is, because the clear cut, even those few trees that you could set up a tree stand with, it's basically all that red pine, where climbing in and out of a tree stand, you can make a lot of noise and very difficult to get in there without being seen as you climb the tree. Same thing occurred when trying to ambush them from the south. Same thing. You have to get close enough to where you can ambush them, but then also the other tree stands are in area. You're gonna run the risk of having some hunter interference, whether you're interfering with someone else or they're interfering with you. So again, you could try to get creative and try to push into the area, but with the other hunter pressure in that area already, it's best to kind of take that spot as a loss and move on to a different location, essentially. So if I couldn't really hunt to the south, where there's clearly a lot more hunter pressure in the area, I proceeded to look to the north. So as we get into here, again, you got the cedar, creek bottom there, and it does rise up to a little bit in different elevation, and you have some intermittent pines along with, outside of that area, more mature timber. And just off that clear cut, just to the north of that cedar area, is an opening where it's kind of a, I really don't even know the plants that are growing in there, but they're about like knee-high plants, definitely some marshy area. Again, there's some cedars around in the area. You've got different forbs growing in there, and all around this area are multiple rubs and scrapes and trails that are traveling, essentially kind of all over from in here. So you got trails going north and south, east and west, and just deer movement clearly in the area. Even to the north part of this little opening, did find what what I have identified as winterberry. So there are some different berries and different food in that area. And again, with that opening, there are some grasses, other things that are clearly being, grown in there and being browsed on by deer. So, it's kind of that food source off the main food source that kind of caught my attention. And then the fact that it was further back into the cover, the idea is that these deer are going to feel more comfortable being around this little opening than they were to be able to come out to the larger clear cut. And then also the size of this opening is small enough where, you're not going to run into like that larger clear cut of having just a vast array of area to cover and a ton of edge that, these deer could be coming in and out of. So set up a camera. And, basically it was this time in the season where, I scouted it, but I didn't know exactly how to get in here without disrupting a lot of the deer movement. So I ultimately didn't hunt this location last year and just let my camera soak and, gather intel. So ended up, during the course of the summer or late summer, towards the 1st of September, went back in there to set up a new camera and basically found the same location where I, had set up kind of a my script again, turned around to go set up my camera, and wouldn't you know, my camera from last year, I clearly had forgotten about it, was still on the tree, basically over the course of all winter long, as well as throughout the summer. So, it was kind of surprising coming across that, and wouldn't you know it, pull up the camera, and it was able to take pictures. The battery life lasted long enough where I had pictures all the way from, from essentially November or mid-November all the way up until June of this year before the camera finally died and stopped taking pictures. So was able to dive in and look at a lot of intel even throughout the course of the late season. And wouldn't you know, again, kind of what I suspected, the deer feel very comfortable moving in that area. There was a ton of daylight, movement from does to bucks. There's even a couple of them that were surprisingly where one very big body deer that had, he had a pretty decent rack, wasn't huge, but the size of the deer body wise indicates that he's definitely an older class deer, which really got my attention. As well as looking at throughout the course of the springtime after the snowfall or after the snow melt, this area actually completely floods out where I had my mock scrape during the fall time was actually partly underwater for a good 2-3 months. That snow or that area really didn't start to dry out till about middle to end of May, when finally there was some dry ground again, in that area where I had originally put my camera. So went out there, let the camera soak for about a month. And I just went out there just this week, and sure enough, got, again, not too surprisingly, a bunch of pictures of does, morning, evening, night, middle of the day, just an area where they feel really comfortable being back here in this denser cover where there's not a lot of people that are focusing or tromping around this area. They feel very safe and secure in here. And again, even more surprising, or more not necessarily surprising, but I'm happy to see that I do have a picture of a nice mature buck that, again, basically I believe the time was at like 4:30, somewhere between 4:30 and 5 o'clock. He showed up on camera in this area, so he clearly doesn't live too far away. The fact that he's just barely, or that is well within daylight, and he's up on his feet moving around back here. So that's an area that, again, kind of had on my radar. It did have some good features where I definitely knew that that main clear cut was the big food source, but I couldn't really figure out how to narrow down on the buck movement. So I went from kind of what I knew and explored into what I didn't know. So basically looking at the further south, again, plenty of intel that would suggest that that's where you could ambush a buck or hunt. But the problem is too, that when it comes to public land, you're looking at a lot of other people have found the same spot as well. So looking the other direction, again, found a spot that's going to be more secluded, not nearly as well known or not, targeted by other hunters, and that the intel does suggest that there are deer that are in the area, feel comfortable in there. But then the next stop was really trying to figure out, now that I got the intel that suggests, that the deer are there, the next thing is trying to figure out my access to get in and out. So ultimately, what I've decided to do is to utilize part of that cedar lowland area, coming off a 2-track to the east, diving into just inside the wood line, traveling along that cedar swamp, a little cedar stretch there. Basically utilizing that is because it is mostly mature cedars where it's kind of wide open. The ground's soft, lots of moss and whatnot, so I can sneak in there and not make a bunch of noise. And then kind of take a beeline to the tree stand that I have set up within bow range of a mock scrape and the camera, as well as the opening. The vast majority of the traffic is basically moving diagonal along with my access route, more or less moving east to west, moving kind of diagonal along, paralleling how that cedar swamp runs. So again, primarily for wind direction, I really want to look at something that's coming out of, essentially the north to, the west, or, the best case scenario would be something that would be directly out of the west, blowing my scent back to the direction where I came from for my exit, for my entry route. All right, and on to the last and final spot. Again, looking at the map, there's really only one thing that really stands out, and it looks like you've got a couple of ponds here. So that's what I had keyed in on my, my interest of the area, the fact that there was a significant water source there. The next part I noticed is that on the pond to the north, there's a little tiny peninsula that comes out and a point that comes out to the from the north as well. And it looks like it could be potential for a water crossing, or an area where there's deer could utilize that to be able to cross between the ponds without having to go all the way around. The next spot, or next thing I'm really looking at, is how those contour lines on the map focal that deer movement as well. So looking at the map, on the west side there's a significant ridge and a plateau, and down to that peninsula you can see there's a gradual decline down towards where the pond is. And then on the east and north side of the pond, there again it gains elevation, but certainly not nearly as steep as on the west side. And then to the south, there is another pond where a trail kind of cuts through in between the two. Same thing, west side of the pond, a higher elevation. And then on the east side, more subtle, drop in the terrain. So again, got a focal point, got a good water source. Terrain seems to could potentially funnel movement. Time to get boots on ground. And within the area, lots and lots of deer sign. No surprise, down through this peninsula, multiple trails where there's rubs that are clearly traveling north and south. Come up to that point in between the two peninsulas. Clearly a couple areas where deer are using that as a water crossing. Essentially on this pond area, the little strip that's to the east is kind of a floating marsh. It looks like it's all grass, but if you walk on it, you're gonna get your feet wet. You're gonna feel the squishy water underneath it, and there's a little tiny, like 8-inch wide little creek that runs through there, draining into the larger pond area to the west. Looking for the further north, basically scouting around the pond, lots of deer trails that again travel around all around basically the pond really. So a lot of them are traveling north and south along the outside edges of the pond. On the west side, you've got two main trails. You got one lower next to the pond, and then one about halfway up on a little bit of a transition, or a little bit of a bench area where you're still not on the peak of the hill yet, but you've got basically a flat area where the the slope of the hill kind of or levels off a little bit and then proceeds to go up the rest of the hill. Again, a main trail that runs off of that. Basically that side hill, technique that, I've seen deer utilize before. And then further to the north, again, as you follow those terrain features that just follow those contour lines, the deer are moving to the north as well. And then there is another main road to the north as well. Through here, a lot of mature timber, a lot of pine, mature maples, basically a lot of this open timber further to the north there. Again, same thing, set up a camera on this water crossing, knowing that that's a bit of a focal point for the movement. It's not necessarily where I saw the vast majority of the deer sign, but just knowing that that could be a pinch point area or an area of interest when it came to potentially ambushing a deer or setting up a hunting spot. Ultimately, there was no real good trees to be able to, set up for like a tree stand location. Or, you could hunt from the ground from that, within that little peninsula area. The hard part is setting up an area where you've got a good enough vantage point where you can still shoot, because there is some, undergrowth around the edges of those ponds that if you're sitting down and whatnot, you may not get a clear shot at the vitals for the deer. So looking at the spot, kind of pinpointing an area off to the east, on the opposite side of that small strip of the pond, looking at that pinch point or that crossing area. Ultimately that's about 70 to 80 yards across. So again, not necessarily good for bow range, but if you were to hunt this spot, or if I were to consider hunting this spot for rifle season or even like muzzleloader or something like that, you'd have a nice clear vantage as deer are crossing through here. And again, once the leaves fall off the trees, you could be able to see deer approaching from the north as well as walking down that peninsula from the south as well. So you could anticipate the deer movement and, capitalize on, catching them at that crossing. So ran the cameras here for about 2 months though, so far. The first get-go, did show promising results where, there was definitely a lot of does that were kind of cruising here. You could actually see them feeding in between those patches there where some of that grass or whatever they're eating was growing in. A nice 2-year-old buck was kind of hanging out there as well, utilizing that. Caught one time caught in 2 different situations where definitely a mature buck was utilizing that crossing. Unfortunately, it was at night and he didn't dilly-dally and spend much time there. Basically coming from the south, moving to the north, and quickly cross that area. But I did get some, at least a good glimpse of them on the camera. Didn't really have enough to where I could really analyze exactly what the buck or how many points he had or whatnot, but it's definitely a mature buck in that utilized that crossing. Basically, with that intel, it led me to suggest that mature buck wasn't necessarily living in the area, but basically the fact that he came from the south on 2 separate occasions means that he's living further south, which leads to, trying to figure out where he's coming from. Now, I haven't been able to explore that south region just yet, but it is going to be something that will, be on kind of the back burner, throughout the course of the season, as well as, for my spring scouting for next year to try to determine or get maybe a better idea of where he's coming from, if he's coming from the south. Again, just this week, pulled the camera again. Kind of seemed like it was a bit of a dud at this point, where a lot of the pictures were ultimately just false triggers and whatnot. Did get a couple pictures of what looked like a deer, just like the back of it and whatnot. But ultimately, the amount of trail camera footage, basically really slowed down from the last time that I had checked it. So starting to think that maybe this area was a bit of a dud, or at least, not as promising as I initially thought. So after pulling the camera, kind of walked off to the west to try to check the pond, looking, because there's basically a goose that was, squawking over there. So I figured maybe go check it out. Maybe it could be a good potential, pond or whatnot to do some waterfowl hunting or something like that. And I didn't make it more than, 20, 30 yards. Heading towards the pond, bedded right on the edge of the pond, was I think that same 2-year-old buck that I caught on the camera before, he jumped out of his bed and ran to the south. So again, it was kind of one of those things like, kind of reassurance that maybe this spot isn't as bad as I initially thought based on the camera intel. So that was a bit of a reminder that the trail cameras don't always tell you the full story. That buck was bedded, within 30, 40 yards of where that camera location was. And, if I'd just gone off the camera, if I hadn't decided to walk over to that pond, it would have looked as if that, that spot was maybe a bust. But again, same thing, kind of that compounding, features that I look for in a spot. So we got a, not necessarily a true, standout food source. Now, even though along those pond edges, there is a lot of grasses, whatnot, a bunch of other things growing in because of that, good water source there. Big one is the water, and then the terrain that focuses the movement. So you could, certainly could look at up on top of this ridge here above the pond. It's an area that I hadn't explored more yet as well, or utilizing the terrain feature of those peninsulas, funneling deer movement to make it more predictable. And again, these are just a few of the spots that I'm kind of focusing on this year. Now, there's certainly other things that you could, pay attention to. Everyone has kind of their own thing that they focus on when it comes to their scouting or the areas of interest for them. Again, this is just kind of how my mindset works, and, just key in on areas that, has, potential for, increased deer movement. There's certainly, you can hunt anywhere really and run into a deer, run into even a good buck. A lot of times what I'm looking at is areas that just, potentially have an increase of the likelihood of a deer being in the area, or a reason why a deer is there. So looking at something, whether it's food, water, the terrain, and again, looking for something that stands out. I don't know how many times I've gone out and, scouted an area, and, it's basically all mature timber. And then you just happen to look off in distance, and you just see a little patch of something that's just a little bit thicker, a little bit denser. Maybe there was a deadfall or something like that allowed some undergrowth to come in. And you walk up there and there's, deer trails. There might be rubs, there might be a scrape there, or you might even bump a deer out of it. I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent here. And, another area where I hunt, in a different county where, it's a lot of mature timber, mainly utilizing terrain. It's kind of more hill country. And, I basically was looking at this area and trying to figure it out in regards to, hunting and kind of doing some still hunting and whatnot. And, if you look at the area, as is, kind of up on top of this ridge, it looks like there's basically really nothing there, or there's no movement. Little tiny patch of cedars. I mean, this thing is probably like 20 by 30, in area. And, basically as I started approaching it, thinking maybe there might be something bedding in there, maybe I can see where the deer have been feeding in there, somewhere along that line. Sure enough, bump, a group of does out of that little patch. Ultimately, it's just a little tiny valley, all mature timber. I mean, you could see the whole valley except for this little patch of cedars in there. As you walk up, there's just a group of deer in there. I always kind of chalk that up to the same as like when you're fishing, especially for like bass or something like that, where you're looking for something that stands out, whether it's, a thick bunch of cover, or like, something that just stands out. Is it a drop off, with a weed bed? Is it a submerged tree? Is it a rock bed? Something like that. Something that stands out that just kind of focals that movement. I don't know how many times either too where, just looking at, even just it may not have a change in or a change in the cover. You might have an area that, it's relatively all the same, maybe a little bit understory, a lot of mature trees, and you look over and there's just a little tiny ditch or a little tiny, bench or ridge. Maybe not even has to be anything more than like maybe 10 feet, higher than what you're already at. But if you get over there, more often than not, you'll see that there's that change in the elevation for whatever reason, focuses those deer move in that area, whether they like having the high ground or if they like feeling that little seclusion of being a little bit lower than everything where when they're not standing out. Whatever the case is, I'm always looking for something that sticks out or is a little bit different than the surrounding area. Now, sometimes I've gone to areas like that and it's not what the map makes it appear as though. And then other times, it looks good, but the deer just aren't there for, they're missing some component that they don't have the reason to have to go through that area or be in that area. So a lot of times, it's kind of a hit or miss when it comes to an area that you scout out on the map. But then if you look back, or if you get boots on ground, you can either determine that if it's an area that is an area of interest or does have deer movement, and if it doesn't have quite what you're looking for, you can follow whatever sign is in that area, follow it out, kind of expand that search area and see if you can find a higher concentration somewhere elsewhere, or figure out where the deer are going or where they're coming from and try to focus in on that. And again, this is just my, how I approach it. Again, you might have your own, way of doing it or things that you focus on, whether you're focused on simply terrain or water sources or those food sources, however you prioritize, the features of the landscape to, find deer that you're looking for. The big thing is, I would say is, for me, it's always trying to find those areas of the highest concentration for the highest probability of, capitalizing on, where the deer are and the availability to be able to hunt them. So that's it for these locations. Again, hopefully you found it helpful. Regardless of what type of scouting you do, in regards to the e-scouting, there's lots of different apps out there. I've tried them all. I've tried Onyx, HuntStand, HuntWise. The app that I'm currently using for this podcast is Spartan Forge. It's a new one I've tried out this year. Really good features. Kind of the one that I like the best on this regard is their 3D mapping. It's one of the best I've seen out of the different types of apps. I can pull it up here and change the view of it so you can see kind of a bird's eye view of the terrain and how those deer may utilize it. And just kind of gives me a better idea of the true layout. Sometimes reading the contour map isn't always the easiest to really do. Sometimes you can't really see exactly how steep a hill is, just looking at the contour line. So by switching it over to the 3D mapping, you can kind of get a better layout of how, the steepness of hills, or you can follow along that, down that point or down that ridge and be able to, get a better understanding of the area itself. But again, started rambling again, so we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. Again, basically we've got a week left before season starts, so hopefully you've got all your preparations and done. You're ready to go. Your bow's tuned up. You've been practicing. You've got your camouflage ready to go. Your tree stands ready to go. So yeah, let's wrap it up with that, and we'll be talking to you next week. So again, as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.